want to acknowledge, too, our university and community sponsors, the University of Iowa's International Programs and the University of Iowa's Honors Program. They contribute vital time, talent, and logistics to our organization. I also thank the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization for their financial support, and today's financial sponsors, which is the Community Foundation of Johnson County. Our programs are made possible by the financial support of these sponsors. Now, I am pleased to introduce Eric Tate. He is an assistant professor at the University of Iowa's Department of Geographical and Sustainability Sciences. He conducts research in the areas of flood hazards, water resources, and social vulnerability, primarily focusing on the development of geospatial indicators to examine the environmental and society interactions. Eric earned a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Engineering at Rice University, a Master of Science in Water Resources Engineering from the University of Texas, and a Ph.D. in Geography from the University of South Carolina. Please join me in welcoming Eric Tate.
Thank you so much, Janet. So I'm going to talk to you today about a project I've been working on for 3 or 4 years with some collaborators and students. And it's actually sort of an accidental project because this is not really the core of what I do. So I'm a hazards geographer. So my main interest is the interactions between natural hazards and society. So for instance, with floods, which is a big focus, how do the way that we organize our buildings within the floodplain affect the severity of floods? And then how does the severity of floods affect, human impacts and future organization? So I do a lot of work with indicators, metrics that you're used to try and understand sort of big abstract systems. And I was given a talk with that on, one of the engineers here on campus saw my presentation. We talked afterwards. She said, I've been working on this project and this proposal for India to look at rainwater harvesting. And I didn't know what she was talking about at the time. But then we started talking and we wrote the proposal together. And to my surprise, it was funded. So, the next year I was in South India learning about rainwater harvesting. So this is sort of halfway through the results of an exploratory project through the National Science Foundation, which are just trying to understand sort of the underlying processes associated with some human environment issue. So, so this is a talk about rainwater harvesting in South India and what that has to do with sustainability. So why is this type of research even important? Why would the National Science Foundation want to even fund something like this? Well, fundamentally, we're having, globally challenges with population gains that are constraining the availability of water resources around the world. Now, I'll describe what this map is showing. This is a water footprint map, which is essentially showing water consumption on a per capita basis across the world. And so the areas in red, the United States included, using a lot of water per capita, where other places, this is water availability and consumption, like India, China, are lower. Now, the organizers of this study set sort of a level of stress below which you're water stressed. And they put a value of 1,700 cubic meters per person per year. So the U.S. is well above that. We're in the 2,500 range, where if you go to India, on average for the whole country, right, 1,000 to 1,200. So on average, this is a very water-stressed place. So we've got population gains, increases. We've got needs for more agricultural production. So the stresses that are in place now, it's not likely we're going to have greater water availability going forward, even more stress on water. So the places that are stressed now are likely to be even more stressed in the future if we don't start thinking about ways to alleviate that. So this is emblematic. One dimension, this is physical water scarcity. Is there just enough water to meet the needs of the people? That's different than sort of economic water scarcity, which would be, can we have the means to to develop these sources, the engineering, the money to transfer water from places to place, that kind of thing. Often associated with major environmental impacts like depletion of groundwater, inequities in the distribution of water. So here we have a couple of photos here. One of women in India, I guess that's Africa maybe, traveling, well, that might be India, traveling great distances to fetch water every day, essentially. The bottom picture is a sand dam in Kenya. So this is an example of sort of lower technology solutions to help impound water, store water in shallow groundwater so that people can use them for domestic consumption. So in places where there's unequal water allocation, seasonal precipitation, we've got challenges, we have some solutions, and the systems that I'm looking at in India are along that line. So we've got agricultural intensification going all over the world, but 80% of global agriculture is rain-fed agriculture. And if you look sort of the global average for water use for irrigation, it's around 70%, but in more and less developed national settings, it's about 90% of all water is used for agriculture. So population gains, we're going to need more food, we're going to need more water to do it, okay? So the intensity of agricultural production, the yields, the productivity are going to have to increase despite our limited water resources. Oops, wrong way. So one of the things that a lot of places are doing, even here in the United States, I mean, we look at California, major declines in groundwater levels. They're on the order of hundreds of feet. In India, there are some places in Western India that they will be out of water. They have tapped all the surface water, they've tapped all the groundwater, and they're looking at a case in 10, 20 years where there will be no water, period. This is the future of many places around the planet unless we think of some other ways to deal with this. So groundwater depletion, saltwater intrusion may be associated with it. So in India, challenged with just the climate. It's a monsoonal climate. So our study area is in South India. And it's a semi-arid region, but the rainfall they get is confined to 2 narrow bands during the year, okay? And it's defined by the monsoon. So the first is a southwest monsoon. This typically hits somewhere in the August to September timeframe, okay? And then the second is the northeast monsoon, where about 50 to 60% of the annual rainfall comes in about a 2-month period between November, late October to maybe mid-December, essentially. So, and then pretty much the rest of the year after that, not much rain at all. So you couple that with sort of between year variability. Let me go back there. You don't need to see the numbers on here, but just basically the graph is showing annual precipitation. And you can see that even within a season, within the monsoon, there's not constant availability of precipitation. But between years, there may be extreme drought years followed by flush years, followed by drought years. But people need to live in these places and survive. So over the years, over the centuries, over the millennia, as a climate adaptation, people in South India have basically set up systems to store water during the monsoon and then use that when it stopped raining for agricultural purposes, for drinking water, for their needs in other times of the year. So there's evidence of these, what they're called tanks. There's small surface water reservoirs, surface water impoundments, going back to 150 BC in this area. Sort of the height of the period of this construction is probably around 700 AD to 1300 or so. And as people start looking into this, they find that there's a greater intensification of the construction and use of these tanks around times of drought. So we talk about climate adaptation today, but yet, this is not something brand new. People have been adapting, doing adaptations to their climate for a long time. So essentially what they do is they find a natural depression in the ground surface where water might drain through and pond up a little bit, and then start to build sort of an earthen dam around that. And so now, instead of just impounding a little bit of water, there'll be quite a bit that's stuck behind that earthen dam. And that way they can store and use their water for other purposes. So this is sort of a diagram of a tank, a typical tank in India, okay? Let me see if I can get the... So you have water that's coming from upstream areas, essentially, okay? And it's going to start filling in behind this earthen dam that's called a bund, okay? So that's depicted sort of here, this brown dam here, okay? And here's a picture of it down on the bottom. The water will start piling up behind that, okay? And through the bund itself, there are basically small channels. And on the water side, going through as a sluice, essentially. So you can go in, then you can open a gate, you can let water pass through where the water's impounded to the other side where you're going to have agricultural fields, essentially. Okay, so this can be controlled by the local villagers. That's the sluice with the man standing on it. So you can actually go inside there, you go down 6-8 feet, and you can open and shut the gates. On the other side of the dam, of the bund, are these agricultural parcels. And so these will be private landowners, and they may be growing subsistence crops, rice typically, or maybe cash crops, maize, sugarcane, chili peppers. And so the water passes through the sluice, and then they'll have like hand-dug channels that they can route water from where the sluice is to their particular parcel. And they're pretty low tech. I mean, you can just take a shovel, and they're maybe this high. The water's going through. You take the shovel, you fill it up with dirt, and route it somewhere else when you're ready for that. Also, in the downgrading area, known as the command area, increasingly what you're going to see also is open wells, okay? And so these are dug down 50, 60 feet, and it's tapping the shallow groundwater, which then they can extract well after the monsoon rains are gone. So these tanks not only is providing surface water that's going to go through the bund, but it's also recharging groundwater, which then can be tapped through the open wells. And these tanks are ubiquitous across the landscape in southern India. So this is Tamil Nadu. This is one of the southeastern states, southern state. And there's an estimated 40,000 of these across the landscape. And in India, an estimated 160,000 tanks. So this is not a rare occurrence to see something like this. A major aspect of water sustainability management. These tanks are actually quite useful. So what I've described so far is the use of tanks for agriculture to irrigate crops. But some of the larger tanks, so most of them are on the order of, 50 to 100 acres. The larger ones, though, while the tanks are full, they may stock it with fish and grow fish. They may rear ducks. When the tanks dry up after the rainy season, what's happened is there's been a lot of inflow, just like on a riverbed. People want to do farming on there because there's rich silt soils. These also accumulate in the tank. They can take this silt and use it for fertilizer. Others will take it and they'll make bricks. So there's a lot of economic activity that can be around these tanks. However, there's also social benefits associated with it too. Almost every tank is associated with a tank temple, okay? And so there'll be religious ceremonies, weddings, burial ceremonies, festivals that are associated with these tanks, okay? So there's a great deal of social significance to them and cultural significance. There are also many environmental benefits to it. by having these tanks, is providing these areas with a measure of flood control. It's recharging groundwater. We had a graduate student who went in the field there for about 3 or 4 months, and he said when they filled up, all of a sudden you saw all this waterfowl just show up out of nowhere. So it's almost like these temporary wetlands that have, a lot of ecological functions as well. So the tanks are not just an economic engine. They have really big social and environmental impacts as well. So what I'm showing here is sort of the typical sustainability spheres, the environmental, the social, and the economic. In many ways, tanks fulfill sort of the mission of sustainability, having intersecting impacts across these dimensions. So it's a new technology. It's an ancient technology, and maybe it's one that we can use to deal with some of our current problems. Here's some pictures of the tank. So here's just a sluice right here going through the tank. Oops. Let me get my cursor. I don't have it. So this is when the tank is dry, essentially, right here. The next, going left to right, is the inside of one of these open wells. They're in the downgrading area. Inside of it is an electric pump set, essentially. So now they can take prodigious amounts of water out by just turning on your generator. In the next picture to the right is some of the, you can identify that this tank is associated with a temple, essentially. And so you might see figures like this at different tanks. Going back down to the bottom corner now, it's showing some of the agricultural areas just down gradient of the tank. So if you have water, then you can grow crops that are going to make you more money. Some of these water-intensive crops, like rice, for example. So it's not just for subsistence. You can sell the excess and make some money for your household. In the next one, E, this is one of the larger tanks. And so they'll have wells here where people can come up and get drinking water. So you'll see these drinking water containers. People just ride their bike up to it, get some water, and go. So it really helps in terms of water availability. The next one, F, is just showing some livestock, some sheep, goats, I guess. In this case, you'll see herders come and just take their flock there, and they'll water up, and then they'll leave. And then finally, the one on the right is showing how many of these tanks you see across the landscape. So there's been some changes, though, in the trends with tanks. And a lot of this has to do with the Green Revolution, right? Iowa's own Norman Borlaug played a key role in this in helping to develop these dwarf varieties of wheat, for example, that were a little bit more drought resistant and pest resistant. The key was, though, that they needed more water if you wanted to really increase productivity, because now instead of like one growing season, if you had enough water in some of these new wheat and rice varieties, you could have multiple plantings per year. So this is a way to really increase productivity in a time in India in the 40s and the 60s where they were facing mass famine. Okay, so this wasn't just an economic imperative. This was survival of many people in the nation. So high-yielding crop varieties, more and more water you need, but then it also led to a lot of environmental consequences: groundwater depletion, pollution. Now you need fertilizers as well. Socially led to class disparities. There's, you start looking into this and you see some increasing rates of like farmer suicide as they get into heavily in debt and then can't pay the money back. So the British, you start reading the literature and there's always this talk about tanks are declining versus a previous time. And you can certainly one time of great decline was when the British were in charge, because they were really interested in these massive engineering projects. So they'd build these massive dams and these canals. They would take water from one river basin to another river basin. And so these tanks are kind of local low-tech solutions, so they weren't really all that favored, and so declines happened then. But really, another big decline came with sort of the electrification of the rural areas. So now they can use pulling groundwater up from these wells at rates you could never do in the past. So this graph is showing trend lines of tank irrigation versus irrigation from wells. And so from 1965 to 2005, the irrigation from wells is going up, irrigation from tanks is going down. Going from 50,000 to over 200,000 wells from 1905 to 1971. And meanwhile, the area irrigated by these tanks has been decreasing. So here's kind of a look at open well, and now you can water at rates that you could never do in the past. So in some places, in Chennai to the northeast, Madurai, which is in sort of south-central Tamil Nadu, you're having declines in the water table of 30, 50 meters. And so not only you can take more water out, but the water table's going, so now you have wells that are dried out. Something like 15% of the wells are completely dried. 40% are at risk, so then you have to dig deeper wells. It costs more money, and maybe the water quality isn't quite as high. So really, who benefits from this system? Well, it's going to cost money to dig your wells. The government has been giving subsidies for the electricity, so that's free. So really, if you happen to own land on the down gradient side of the bund, and you can afford to put in a well, you can make a lot more money than those who don't have those resources. So, combining the electrification and sort of the government subsidies has spread out sort of income inequalities. Meanwhile, these tanks, they operate through shared governance. Over the centuries, the communities would come together because during the off-season when the tanks are dry, well, they need maintenance. Okay, the bund may have erosion, the sluice may need repair. They need to dig out silt from the tank because otherwise its capacity is less. And so families would come to, each family, a household would, volunteer people and they would do the work. But now if you're a wealthy landowner and you've got a well just south of the bund, then why do I need to participate in this? So in some ways, this also led to a destabilization of sort of this shared community involvement. So you got a lot of trend lines that are going against the use of tanks, essentially. This is a national problem, though, too. What I'm showing here is maps that are created through the GRACE mission from NASA. So the GRACE mission is basically 2 satellites that are revolving around the Earth, and they're measuring the gravitational pull. Okay, and so one's moving, and then as it reaches like a landmass or a place where there's more and more water, it'll get pulled a little faster. And then the second one that's trailing it, as it gets to that, it'll catch up. So it measures the distance between these 2 satellites, and that gives you a little bit of understanding of how much water is there. So they can measure how much water is in an aquifer through these satellite mission. And what you're seeing here is, you look across India, the one on the left in the red, Rajasthan area, you have real problems with groundwater depletion. This is showing groundwater withdrawals as a percentage of recharge. So in these areas, you're having more withdrawals than recharge. Completely unsustainable. The one on the right is actually zooming in to the southern state of Tamil Nadu. And I've circled sort of I don't know if you can see it in green. This is our study area. So maybe tanks are a solution to some of these challenges with declines in access to water resources. Maybe it helps ensure more equitable distribution of water, maybe. But it's certainly not a panacea. There's some challenges associated with it too. So we've been working with a local nonprofit called the Don Foundation. And their basic goal is human development and poverty reduction. So they have several programs going on, microfinance programs, sort of farmer education. But one of them is construction of tanks, because they're saying that access to water can then increase agricultural productivity and therefore decrease poverty. And so what they do is they come to a community and they say, here's the deal. We will help you with the technology and the know-how to build these tanks, but you've got to get some skin in the game. You need to do a 25% cost share to do this. And that cost can be met through your labor. And so we'll go and we'll raise money from the Ford Foundation and all these other big organizations, and we'll bring in the bulldozers and we'll help do this. But you have to come together. You have to agree as a community, first of all, that this is a priority for you and you're going to maintain this stuff. And then we'll come in and help you. And then once it's built, we're gone, and you guys need to continue this, right? And so they are really involved in tank construction, so we've been working with them. What should be the solutions to decreasing water availability? Well, traditionally, we keep thinking sort of a supply side path. We need to build bigger canals, more dams, more groundwater wells, more water, essentially. There's others that say, well, we need to attack the demand side. Let's think about water conservation and toilets and, all the little things that can add up and be really impactful. Yet a third sort of group is the soft path approach that's saying we need to think about things sustainably. We need to make decisions about water from a bottom up, involving the people. And we don't need to have these really big engineering construction projects. So this is one type of climate adaptation for dealing with water insecurity, and so tanks really fall within the soft path approach, which you'll hear about from time to time. So we have basically two research questions that we went in with. So my collaborator is a civil engineer. She's now at Nandita Basu, and she's now at the University of Waterloo. She was here in the environmental engineering department. And so her questions are around the lines of the physical water condition. Her work is with water budget. Okay, so in my water resources class, I teach about the hydrologic cycle, right? You have evaporation and condensation, and then you have runoff and recharge and all this kind of business, right? So really, the total amount of water within this cycle is the same. It's just a matter of how that's distributed. Are you having more evaporation or more recharge or whatever? So she's trying to understand the dynamics. When water enters the tank system, what happens? How much of it is overflowing? How much of it is infiltrating into the ground? How much of it is evaporating? How much has been taken up by plants, for example? To have an understanding of how these things do from a physical water standpoint. And my question from the geography standpoint and the indicator standpoint is, can you actually come up with some metric that can measure water sustainability? So say Don Foundation is about to invest some money, or where should they invest? I mean, part of it's going to be the interest in the community to do it, but maybe there's some places where interventions could make a much bigger impact than others. Do they want to invest in places that need a lot of help? Maybe invest in places that are already showing that they're managing water sustainability or sustainable in sustainable ways. So from the first standpoint, the physical, what sort of this work is showing is that, conceptualizations of surface water and groundwater as two separate things are not all that useful, where it's actually really one system. Okay, so the water comes into the tank, it's going to infiltrate into the groundwater, and then that water may be available throughout the year. So a lot of that water actually in the tank, this has some benefits, okay? You have this tank system, you can have flood control, okay? Because it's going to stop these peak flows from going downstream. It's going to store it in the tank. Any overflow is going to go downstream, and then it's going to be stopped by the next tank. So you're not having as much exposure to flood damage. It can recharge the groundwater, but it also has some potential negative impacts as well. Well, yes, you're decreased runoff, which is good for flood control, but maybe there's not as much water available to you if you're a downstream community. What if you're way at the end of the downstream end and maybe you're not getting any water at all? So in some ways, this has led maybe more cohesion within communities, but greater conflict between communities, okay? The second is, depending on the local soils, building tanks can be terrible, because if you have a lot of clay soils, this water is not going to infiltrate into the groundwater. You're just having this giant evaporation pan. They're shallow, and so you're impounding the water, but you're losing it all to evaporation in a few weeks. You're not really getting the benefit. So it can have some positives and negatives. So we went out in the field and we sort of used geographic technology. We took sort of a really high resolution GPS essentially. And what we want to understand is what's sort of the relationship between the area in a tank, a surface area of the tank, and its volume, okay? So one of the things we did is we took this really high resolution GPS and we'd walk these transects when the tanks were dry, okay, to get an understanding of the topography. Then we can take it back, take those measurements, put it into a computer system, a GIS, and we can we can put this land surface in there and start to fill it with water, okay? So if we fill it this high, it gets this surface area, so we can start doing some measurements in the computer system of surface area to volume. We can take some field measurements and see if there's a relationship. Now, so this on the right is showing sort of filling the tanks at different elevations. Why do we care about surface area to volume? Well, this takes a lot of effort to just do this. We just did it for 4 tanks here. But like I said, there's almost 40,000 of them across the state. If we can understand, is there a relationship between surface area and volume? So this is showing this relationship for each of the 4 tanks, I think. And Nandita has basically shown that there is a linear relationship, which means we don't need to measure volume. We can measure surface area. And maybe we can measure surface area by looking at remote sensing. So we can take satellite imagery, we can count the area of these tanks and get some basic measurements of what the volume of water storage is in those places. So sort of on a large scale, we can have an understanding of the capacity of these tanks. At a local scale, trying to understand what's the relationship between how much water's in the tank and the soil and how much it's recharging and your groundwater depletion. Basically characterization of the physical elements of the water cycle here. And so another issue that kind of came up while we were doing this is this weed called Juliflora. So Juliflora is nasty, okay? It's got these spikes that are like this, and they will go through your pants, they will go through your shoes. They're very drought resistant, and they suck up a lot of water, okay? And they're quite ubiquitous in some places in the landscape. However, the Indian government actually put it there on purpose, because it actually has some economic benefits. Instead of this is not a place where there's a lot of forests and people have access to firewood, so they'd spray these Juliflora on, it would grow, and people could cut it down, and they'd put them into these piles, like in the top right corner, and basically create charcoal from it. So now you have a fuel source from these weeds. So yes, it's helping here, but yes, it's also taking water. It's just classic of these problems that we have. There's solutions, but yet sometimes they cause other problems. And trying to understand the feedbacks between these can be quite important. So how can you measure water sustainability? Well, we're trying to build an indicator or an index. What is an index of water sustainability? Well, indices and indicators should actually be quite familiar to us because we see them all the time. I mean, you may be going home and you're listening to the news and they say the Dow Jones Industrial Average was such and such. Well, what exactly is the Dow Jones Industrial Average? Well, they take 30 companies, someone chooses what 30 those are, and they take some sort of average of their performance in the day, and then that's taken as an indicator of the market performance. right? We're taking some limited data set. We're saying that's representative of some big concept, okay? What's the best school to go to? What's the best places to live? These are all indicators and indices. But it matters how you build these things, okay? Who's the best soccer team in the world? Well, this is an index. FIFA, in their rankings, they take a look at, okay, what are the teams? Which games do they win? How long ago were these games? How much did they win by? What was the prestige of this game? So like an international tournament carries more weight than sort of a friendly between nations. And so these are all metrics that they're using, and they weight them in different ways. They combine them, and voila, you have that Germany is the number 3 soccer team in the world, right? So this is something we do all the time. So, you know, in my world, I build, instead of these type of indices, I build indices of things like social vulnerability to flood. And in this study, trying to see if we can explore a way to do sustainability of water systems, of these tank systems in South India. So this is one way to think about an index. This is the water poverty index. And so this group basically said, well, thinking about water poverty is these five areas: resource availability, so the physical availability of water, equity in terms of equal access to this, the uses and sort of consumption rates, the management capacity of areas to manage water well, and finally sort of environmental benefits, ecosystem services. And if you start looking at this, build it for a few places, this here is an area with 70% groundwater wells. Okay, so it's doing really well in terms of providing volumes of water, but in terms of the other dimensions like environment and equity, it's faring poorly, right? You have to be sort of a wealthy landowner in order to take advantage of the groundwater wells. In this diagram to the right, it's an area with 70% tanks. Not so much in terms of the volume of water produced, but if you look across the 5 dimensions, maybe it's much more balanced. So maybe areas with greater incidence of tanks is a more sustainable solution. The diagram on the right is areas with a 50-50 mix. So maybe this is a good indicator of water sustainability. Maybe, but one aspect of sustainability is not just these 3 dimensions of environment, social, and economics, but it's a temporal aspect, right? Are these things balanced now and going forward into the future? And so that's kind of difficult to assess. There's not a whole lot of what are the interactions between the natural system aspects and the things that people are doing. There's some gaps in using this as sort of an indicator. Okay, so another way of thinking about this is what people call coupled natural human systems. Okay, there's a human element to this that may be composed of things like population gain and urbanization, our technology, our policies, like the Indian government providing subsidies for electrification. Okay, but there's also some natural system, real and important natural system things like the soil type. Right? Is water going to infiltrate? What's the topography? What's the climate and the hydrology? And that these natural and human system major drivers come together and intersect in different ways that actually have real impacts in terms of what are the groundwater levels and what is food security. Okay, so this is one way to think about it. We came up with a little bit more complex system that's looking at both sort of the scalar things, looking at the big issues from climate and human processes all the way down in sort of a process to what are the exact variables you can measure in terms of maybe agricultural productivity, the equity of access, and the interactions between them. So we can say, for example, maybe the land use is one of these really key variables because so many aspects of the system are intersecting with land use. So not only were we identifying what are the key aspects of the system, but which are the most important, when are they important in the cycle. So if you're looking at an intervention, right, I want to do something that's going to actually have the most bang for its buck. Maybe you can find one of these intersections of processes that's going to touch a lot of stuff, okay? Of course, we need to actually measure this, though. So a lot of these are sort of larger picture ideas. We got to get data to do that. So there's some stuff that's available through the census. There's some stuff that's available maybe through remote sensing. So we've got about probably half of the stuff that we think is important that we can actually measure. And so this is an exploratory project. We are actually going to India next month to meet with the Down Foundation, some really prominent Indian researchers that have been investigating tanks for the last 20 years, some researchers from Waterloo that are interested in sort of governance, environmental governance. And we're going to just brainstorm for about 3 days and like write the next proposal, essentially. So this is stories to be continued. Okay? I just wanted to point out a few of my collaborators here. This is Nandita Basu, some of the grad students we took with us a few years ago. This gentleman here is from the Down Foundation, and the guy on the right is a graduate student in geography right now who's been working on a lot of this stuff. So, yeah, thank you for your time.
Questions. I'm going to ask my first one, which is, could some of these ideas that you have, do you think, be used in California and in our western states in terms of dealing with the drought that they're experiencing there?
So possibly. It's going to take sort of a reorientation of what we think is a solution. We think big here. Science can be the savior to our problems and greater technology, okay? So now they're thinking about, well, we need to have like reflective pellets that we put in reservoirs so it'll reflect the sunlight and stop evaporative losses, you know, greater technology to solve our ills. But maybe, you know, if we sort of adopt more of a soft path approach instead of these big, giant, high technology solutions, maybe lots of smaller issues. But in some ways, it may be in contrast to private property sort of traditions and legal systems that we have here that maybe aren't as strong as in India. Collective governance, we sort of have a more individualistic approach to things. So in some ways, so yes, I think it could be done, but it might take a little bit of a cultural transformation.
I'm going to put a couple of these together. First of all, who came up with the idea of the tanks? Was this a native population idea or outside technological assistance? Water tanks ecosystem? And also the question then was, industrial capitalist development complains much about land acquisition problems in India. Do the complaints show a disregard to the important communal nature of water versus private property?
Okay. What was the first one again?
Where did the idea of the tanks come from?
You know, it's funny. There's been people that have looked at some of these communal water structures all over the world, and they take different forms. If you go to Iran, they have these qanats, which are essentially these tunnels that tap the base of mountain canyons where the groundwater is, and they go for tens of miles at a really slight slope up to places where the ground slope isn't so much. Okay, but these take cooperation from the communities. They have to dig these vertical shafts. They have to dig along the tunnels. People die. It's really dangerous. But so it's a communal water structure. And so you go in different places depending on the local geography. You have different types of solutions. So I think this was, with the tanks, this is not something that came from elsewhere. I think it just developed locally, starting 200 BC. At least that's the earliest evidence we see of them. What was the next one?
The part was industrial capitalist development complains much about land acquisition problems in India. Do the complaints show a disregard to the importance of communal nature of water versus private?
Well, we like to impose our cultural norms on other places. We had a a graduate student who finished a few years ago, and he was looking at the recovery from the East Asian tsunami, the Boxing Day tsunami from 2004, which hit the east coast of India quite hard. And so one of the solutions is a lot of these NGOs came in and they said, well, we're going to provide habitat, housing and water supply systems that, we're not going to have to deal with pollution and pathogens and all this stuff. So they built all these communities for these fishermen that were, a couple miles away from the ocean with technology that's going to be needed to be, things are going to be needed to be replaced. You need to have expertise to run these systems. And it was just totally at odds with sort of the cultural traditions of the area. And not soon after, these places were pretty much abandoned. They weren't using the toilets that they would put in because it wasn't in line, culturally. And what good is it for a fisherman to live, a mile from the beach? So these are things I think we come in with our own belief systems that we ignore. And so, the world is littered with abandoned projects. So I would say, yes, we probably do ignore communal systems.
Next one is, does not the construction of a new tank result in the displacement of farmers and farms? And how are they compensated in a sustainable manner?
Displacement. So there's not really new tanks that are being constructed. What you tend to have is a lot of these 40,000 tanks that are in disrepair. So they're there, and in many cases, like squatters have come and started farming land there. It does lead to some conflict because if you fill up a tank where someone was farming, they don't want their land farmed. So sometimes there's like destruction of the tanks. At night they'll go in and, put a hole in the wall, and then all this water's going downstream and flooding the fields. So there's been some instances of conflict like that. But in general, the land where the tanks are, it's not owned by anybody just because they've gone back so far. Yeah, if you're trying to put in new tanks, that would be more difficult. I think in the city areas, they tend to build, like Chennai, they'd build over them. And instead they're trying to do sort of more modern rainwater harvesting where you have like small tanks on every house or something like that.
India never built a system of sanitation based on piped water under pressure in rural or urban areas. What would happen if 1 billion people were supplied with flush toilets and showers?
Well, that points to one of the challenges. We've got areas of severe water stress now, and we say, the solution to poverty is economic development. But what happens as you increase in, development levels? Well, people want more stuff, right? I want a refrigerator. I want to take showers. I want to have, meat in my diet. And so with increasing levels of affluence, we're going to have more and more demands on environmental systems. So we need more solutions that are going to use water, I think, more sustainably. So yeah, I think all the indicators are, it's scary,
Next, is there an economical and ecologically friendly way to minimize evaporation of surface water? I think you hit a little bit on this. For example, flooding of agricultural fields seems to waste an immense amount of water.
Well, you got competing demands here. We can not flood the fields. We can grow chili peppers. They can, grow some of these crops that don't need as much water, but they're not going to make as much money. They want to make a lot of money, then they have to, rice is the cash crop, which wastes a lot of money, a lot of water. And there's a lot of people that are actually suggesting that it's increasing malaria incidence because you're creating these perfect areas for mosquitoes to thrive. So for this, actually, technology may play a really important role. So why do we need to flood the fields all the time? Maybe we can look at some other, drip irrigation types of systems and other uses of technology where you can still get similar levels of productivity without using as much water. But, people are just crisis driven. I see it in the disaster area all the time. We know what's going to reduce flooding. Flooding is like the easiest thing to deal with. When it rains, we know where the water is going to be, right? It's not going to be in the uplands. It's going to be in the river floodplains. It's going to be in the creeks. But yet we still build more and more in them. Why do we have the gym, the university library, the IMU, right? This is like clear floodplain, obvious. But, we continue to make decisions like this, and we only make changes when there's this huge crisis. And so I think with water, it's going to continue to be used and more, until there's just none left or really close to it, and then people will come up with solutions. So I don't get upset about it anymore because...
Well, I think you've actually answered this next question, which is there relevance to Iowa?
Well, you look at a lot of the climate change predictions, and so Iowa's a pretty wet, water-rich state, and it's likely to probably get more water on an annual basis in the future, but that might come with more intra- and interannual variability. So we talked about India with its monsoon seasons, where a lot of the rain falls in one time of the year and not much in the others. That might be the future that's coming towards Iowa, where, yes, overall we get more rainfall, but we get a lot of it in, April and May, and then hardly any of it in July and August. So we're going to have to think about ways to, right now, that's not really an issue. I've lived in South Texas, I've lived in Southern California, where water conservation is, on the forefront of a lot of people's mind. Not really here, but we could be headed for that future.
We now conclude our program, and on behalf of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council, I'd like to give a big thank you to Eric Tate for his presentation. And I also want to thank our sponsors, the University of Iowa's international programs, the University of Iowa's honors program, and the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization for their generous support. And again, we also thank today's financial sponsor, the Community Foundation of Johnson County. Now, Eric, as a small thank you, a token of our appreciation, we have the highly coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug to give you. So here, I give it to you with much thanks.
Thank you.
So thank you again for joining us, and we are adjourned.